Well, welcome to our first unit from Jeremy Harmer's textbook that we're using this semester called How to Teach English. The first chapter is focused on learners, and you should have read it before you came to this video lecture. So if you haven't done that, go ahead and pause and go take a little bit of time to read. It's not too long, and then come on back. Harmer gives us a number of considerations that we need to think about when we think about our learners, our students who we are teaching English to. First, let's just give a little bit of thought to what are some of the reasons that people want to learn English? Think for a second about that question. Why learn English? One important reason that a lot of people learn English is that they're moving to the target language community. They're coming from a society or culture where English is not the dominant language, and they now need to be able to speak English in their new home in order to survive and hopefully to thrive. That would be an important reason people would be learning English. But also there are a lot of people around the world who learn English for specific purposes, or ESP. Sometimes we see that acronym. So these would be folks who maybe work in a particular industry, banking, nursing, law, business, etc., or want to work in one of those industries and really need the language, the vocabulary, and the kinds of phrases that would be appropriate in their field. There's also English for academic purposes. So maybe someone who's planning on earning a degree at an English-speaking university but really needs to improve their reading, writing, listening, and speaking in English in order to be able to perform well in an academic environment. And often that's geared toward scoring high enough on a proficiency exam to be accepted in an English-speaking university. So there's a lot of programs that are offered as English for academic purposes, or EAP. And then of course there's always people who want to learn English just for the purpose of international communication or travel, being able to go to English-speaking countries and get around, or to be able to communicate with international friends who come from English-speaking places. So those are a number of the main reasons why people are often studying English. There's also a variety of contexts for learning, so we'll look at that next, and it might be helpful to define some of our terms that you're going to see throughout this course and probably throughout a number of your TESOL courses. The first is EFL, English as a foreign language. So that's usually something that students are using, like that last category from the previous slide, for travel to places where English is spoken. So this would be similar to like if you took a foreign language in high school, like French or German or sometimes Spanish or whatever the case might be, and that might be useful for going to places where those languages are spoken. That's English as a foreign language when you're not living in the target language community where English is spoken around you. Then there's ESL, or English as a second language, and that's usually taught when the students are physically living in the target language community. So English is spoken in the community outside the classroom. It's usually out of necessity. These students really need to be able to learn English in order not only to survive, but again, hopefully to thrive in the English-speaking community around them. And in that case, the class is usually conducted in the target language, whereas we might see in EFL contexts, maybe if it's class taking place in, say, China, the teacher would speak some amount of Mandarin or whatever dialect they speak there while studying English, whereas in an ESL class, those classes are typically going to be conducted in English. You might also sometimes see the acronym ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. And so that's really kind of an umbrella term that includes EFL and ESL. So our department is the TESOL department, the Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages department, and it's intended that you're trained to be able to speak in, or sorry, to be able to teach in either of those contexts, EFL or ESL. Finally, you'll also be aware that there are bilingual settings or bilingual classrooms and contexts for learning. And so that's a situation where you've got students mostly who are coming from the same L1 or first language background, whether that be Spanish or sometimes maybe Polish or Mandarin here in Chicago. And they are physically living in the target language community, in the English community, English-speaking community that is. And so what you see is that classes are then offered or conducted in both the first language, Spanish, Polish, Mandarin, and the second language, in this case, English. And so students are learning probably a lot of their both language and content in those classes in both L1 and L2. There are a variety of contexts in which people learn English. Think about that for a second. What settings do people tend to be learning English? The first one we might think about are public or private language schools, schools that are specifically created to learn a new language. Those could be in EFL contexts where people would be, maybe either paying or publicly going to learn English. But they also exist in the target language community. So here in Chicago, there are a number of private language schools that adults or children can go to that focus specifically on teaching English, sometimes just for communicative purposes, but other times it's for some of those specific purposes or academic purposes. Obviously, public school systems are places where people learn English, and that's probably where many of you are training to teach as well, because here in the United States and certainly in Chicago, we have a high proportion of students who are English language learners in our public school systems. One-on-one sometimes is a capacity in which people are learning English. Sometimes there's private tutors that they engage in one-on-one learning and teaching, and that can really provide for some really personalized attention around the language goals and needs of an individual. Also, corporations and businesses can sometimes be places where they would bring in an English teacher or tutor to work with some of their employees. Maybe they've got an outstanding chemist or attorney or other professional, but who could use some work fine-tuning their sentence structure or pronunciation or whatever the case might be in English. And so that would be a place where someone would be teaching English. Of course, there are also real and virtual contexts in which people are learning English. Historically, we would be seeing people studying in physical face-to-face kinds of settings, but increasingly with the use of digital tools, virtual classes can be happening so that students on one end of the globe can be taught by teachers on another end, and maybe students are in multiple places around the world with a teacher in another place entirely. And certainly we're seeing the proliferation of a lot of that kind of programming happening in this moment as well. Additionally, often English is being learned in a really casual, non-educational setting, maybe just with a friend who meets with you together to have a conversation partner, and maybe you work on a few specific structures or vocabulary around a specific topic of interest. So sometimes it doesn't have to be necessarily a classroom kind of situation. Harmer talks a lot in this first chapter as well about learner differences, things that we need to consider when we think about the range of students that we might work with. So think for a second about differences that might be considerations when you are thinking about your students. Harmer identifies a number of them in the chapter, including age, learning styles, multiple intelligences, and those last two are pretty closely related. Levels, proficiency levels, as well as some culturally specific issues around the learning approach that our students might be coming from in their cultural background. So we'll look at each of those in the coming slides. The first consideration of learner differences is age, and we probably want to think first about children, which is typically defined as kids or humans between the ages of 2 and 14, and then further from there we kind of break them down into even smaller categories, including very young learners who are 2 to 5 years old, young learners, 5 to 9 years old, adolescents who are 12 to 17, and then young adults who are 16 to 20. In general, children from that whole range, we can say of them that they tend to learn by fully absorbing their context. They take in information from what's going on around them. They're using their 5 senses often to learn in a much more engaged way than sometimes adults do. The younger the children are, the less effective it is to try and teach them grammar rules and other abstract concepts related to language. Things need to be a bit more concrete for them to conceptually be able to manage. Children are very responsive to activities that focus on their lives, their interests, their activities. And as you probably are aware, attention span can be limited, especially for our very young learners. And then, and it kind of continues to grow as they get older as well. But that is a consideration we need to think about when we think about our youngest learners, that the mixing up and changing of activities rather frequently is necessary. Looking at the next group of adolescents, more specifically, that group it's not exactly chronological. It doesn't begin exactly at 12 years old because it has more to do with the onset of puberty. But when we think about adolescents, we can say that they have typically a greater capacity for those kinds of abstract thought around concepts related to language. They have a passionate commitment to things that interest them. So one of the middle school teachers that I taught in a class recently was saying that one of the hallmarks of her middle school students is that they are consistently self-absorbed, and that she really tries hard to tailor her lessons and the content that she's giving them by incorporating some of the specific interests of her middle school age students, because it keeps them engaged, it keeps them interested. And adolescents do have a greater capacity for that kind of analytical, critical thinking that we saw that younger children don't tend to have. Finally, I want to think a little bit about adults. Adults bring many experiences from their life up until this point that they can draw on in their learning, much more so than children can. Adults tend to be a bit more disciplined as students. They tend to come to learning a language with specific goals in mind, specific focus. That might be career-oriented, that might be surviving in a new culture-oriented, that might be travel-oriented. Whatever the case might be, they tend to sort of know what they want to do and work toward that goal. At the same time, some of their personal history may hamper their learning. So if they've had past negative learning experiences, that could really turn them off. Classrooms may be actually daunting to them after many years away from school. So if they've experienced some amount of failure, they may be expecting more failure just upon walking into the classroom. They may find that they're kind of rusty, having not studied in a classroom type setting for a long time. So those are some considerations when we think about the different age groups of our learners. Another important consideration with learner differences is this concept that Harmer talked about of neuro-linguistic programming, or sometimes the NLP model. And this is a model that identifies or that outlines how people are most influenced, usually by one of these three kinds of stimuli: visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, or kinesthetic stimuli. This model is really the foundation of the learning styles theory, which I'll talk about in a minute. This image kind of helps us to think about this NLP communication model. So you'll see in this image on the right, there's this arrow of an external event, some kind of stimuli that's sort of coming at the person on the left. So they're taking in this stimuli, they're either seeing it, or they're hearing it, or they're tactile feeling it. Or maybe they're doing all three of those things. They're taking it in all of those modalities, but probably one of those modalities, or maybe two, are going to be really keying into how they are experiencing that external event, that stimuli. So that's coming in, it's going through these filters, which are either deleting or distorting or generalizing that input that they're receiving. And it becomes, goes through those filters and becomes this kind of internal representation in the person's brain until it becomes sort of integrated into a state and into their physiology, into their body. And sort of comes back out from the learner as some kind of behavior, some kind of response to the input that they received. And again, the idea is that we each have a tendency toward more auditory or more visual or more tactile learning in how we experience input, and we're more powerfully able to learn and better remember what we've learned by one of those modalities typically. And so there are some strategies that we can teach our learners for each of those three kinds of modalities, and some strategies and tips that we can kind of exploit as their teachers. So for our auditory learners, some things we can do are say the info aloud that is to be learned, to read their work out loud, have your student read what they're writing out loud, or what they're working on out loud rather than just in their head. Record themselves summarizing what they have read. So after they read, have them speak out loud and make a recording so that they can hear it as well. When writing, plan each sentence you write by saying it aloud or saying it in your head. Saying words and each letter of those words aloud. This especially helps with spelling, just being able to hear yourself spell those words out. And when it comes to things like doing math or other conceptual things, sometimes explaining out loud to yourself the steps you're taking can really help with that kind of auditory learning style. When it comes to our visual learners, some of these strategies can be helpful, such as taking notes or making pictures, graphs, and charts, just really trying to convert the things that they're thinking about into images that they can be focused on. Sitting close to the teacher so they can really key into gestures, expressions, the way that the teacher is moving and speaking. Can be really helpful for visual learners. Using color coding clues, so color coding notes, color coding charts, really engaging with a lot of things that are visually stimulating in terms of color. Using flashcards, so they're not just hearing words, but they're able to see them as well. Jotting down ideas as they form in your mind, so as you start to think about things, getting those down in a way that you can see them. See the word, look at it, then close your eyes and see if you can visualize it even once your eyes are closed. And then in terms of things like math or other more abstract concepts, making pictures or tallies or other ways of writing and drawing it out with your math problems. And then finally, for our kinesthetic or tactile learners, making sure that things on their desk that would be that they would be tempted to sort of grab at and get really distracted by, especially for our younger kinesthetic learners, that can be really important in terms of maintaining focus, or giving them something that is okay for them to kind of manipulate with their hands that won't cause a distraction for themselves or others. When reading, maybe cover the page, like if there's 2 pages open, cover the page or the portion of the page that you're not reading so that you're engaging your hands in touch, even in a reading exercise. Tracing spelling words with your finger while you're practicing spelling them can engage our tactile learners. And other things that engage whole body kinds of experiences in learning, like doing role plays or constructing models to help reinforce what you've learned. Building things with their hands or bodies is really important for our kinesthetic learners. Related to the idea of learning styles is the concept of intelligence. What does it mean to be either intelligent or unintelligent? Think about that for a minute. How do you feel about the terms intelligent or unintelligent? Do they potentially seem limiting? Have they been used against you or against someone you know? Well, Howard Gardner really reacted against the notion of a single kind of intelligence and in IQ tests that were really developed in the first part of the 20th century. And his idea was that IQ tests basically favor people who are good at taking tests. He said there are multiple kinds of intelligence and that different intelligences might be more or less developed in a single individual. So he said there are really these 8 or 9 different kinds: mathematical, musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, spatial, emotional, linguistic, naturalistic, and then existential. And so actually for some of your activities for Unit 1, you're going to be doing a test to determine what are your different intelligences as well as your learning style. That may help you think about how you, as a learner, learn, And ideally, that's going to help you think about different ways that your students learn as well, and how can we make sure that we're engaging all those different modalities of learning and intelligence. Beyond those different kinds of learning styles and intelligences, it's important to think about our learner differences in terms of their proficiency levels. So when we look at adults, we tend to talk about beginners as English language learners. Those are our students who don't know any English at all, who are really starting at that level 1 or level 0 even, in a sense. The next group that they would move on to would be intermediate, and that's really the largest, more sort of amorphous group among them. These labels can be a bit rough and they can vary from institution to institution, but our intermediate learners tend to be those that have basic competence in speaking and writing. They have the ability to comprehend basic listening and reading. They may at a certain point, their success may start to sort of level off or hit a plateau where it's less obvious how much they're growing than when they were beginners and growing by leaps and bounds. And ultimately, there are advanced learners. So those are those that are competent in English. They can read and communicate fluently. The teacher can focus less on grammar accuracy and more on things like style, on perceptions of appropriacy. So when you say something in a certain way, in which contexts and to which individuals, things like connotation, so when a word has a negative or a positive twinge, things like inference, which you're meant to understand by what is said, even when it's not in the words that are said. And also collocations, things like which words go with words in English in ways that don't sound awkward, but that sound natural, like the way we use those words. So those examples like, may I have a word with you? That's a really nuanced kind of appropriacy that an advanced learner can use. So they would know when to say that instead of something like, come here, I want to talk to you, or let me talk to you. They would understand the softness, the nuance of, may I have a word with you? Also, I cannot make it. That's a very strange phrase to an English language learner. What you're saying is, I can't come, I cannot make it. But that's something that our advanced learners can kind of come to understand, some of those pragmatic parts of the English language that are more challenging. And it's important to think about levels because we have to think about what's appropriate and inappropriate for students at various levels. So what would be inappropriate for some of our beginner learners? Well, certainly something like an abstract or discursive essay would be a much higher level activity than our beginning learners could ever handle, and that would be very discouraging to them. But what do we do with our beginners? Well, one thing we want to make sure we do when we work with beginners is to exaggerate our gesture and our voice. We rough tune. We help them to understand with our physical bodies and our facial expressions and the way we use our voice that's beyond just the words that we're saying, to help them understand what we're communicating at that level. Inappropriate for some of our advanced students would be things we might do with our beginner students, things like drills where we work on simple phrases over and over again until they are second nature, where we work on conjugating verbs in a way that would be just really tiresome for our more advanced students. Other meaningful terms related to levels come from the Common European Framework that was discussed in Chapter 1. So sometimes we have what are called false beginners. Those are some students who maybe have been living in the target language community for a little while, know some English, but they're really not able to use it. So sometimes they come in and they know a few phrases, which makes us think they're further along than they are. And then we end up having to sort of backtrack and realize that we need to start at square one. The CEFR also breaks up intermediate into a few subcategories, including pre-intermediate, who are not quite at the intermediate level as we described it before, but they have learned some basic structures of English. And then, of course, there's upper intermediate, who have the competence of those intermediate students, plus they have some grammatical structure that's and use that is more complex. They may act sort of accuracy and depth of knowledge of those advanced students and what they can do with the language. many of you will be working with the English levels that are described by the organization WIDA in our public school system. And so those would be identified as 6 levels, starting with entering, beginning, developing, expanding, bridging, and finally reaching. And so if you look at this chart here, I would actually encourage you to just go ahead and pause the video and have a look through these can-do descriptors. They can really give you kind of a feel for what students can do at these different ELL levels. And if you want to read even more in terms of descriptions of levels and can-do statements, there's a link in the Day 1 folder to WIDA's website and some more information on that. But I would just take a minute to look through and get a sense of what our students can do at each of these levels. Another important difference when it comes to our learners can be educational and cultural background. So differences in terms of things like the value of education that may be coming from the culture and society that the learners originally coming from. For our students, our younger students, how much parental help is available can be different depending on the family situation and what their cultural value of education was. There can also be some real differences in terms of expectation of what teaching and learning involves, especially for our adult students. They may be coming from situations where teacher was the ultimate authority and teacher kind of sort of delivered the lesson, and students were expected to be much more passive, much more politely quiet in class. Then we may expect students to be much more engaged and involved and ask questions and raise their hand and offer to answer and take more responsibility in terms of their participation on themselves. Students may have come from a situation that involved more rote learning versus learning by doing. So they might be from a context where school and learning was really about memorizing lists, memorizing terms, sort of repeating back what the teacher said. Student thinks it and says it the same way. Whereas we here in our educational contexts in this culture may be more focused on things like inquiry, on project-based learning, on engagement in the learning process by our learners. So think for a minute about which kind of education did you experience? What was the value of education from the culture you grew up in, your family's value of education and how much they were available? What were your expectations around teaching and around learning? Did you do much rote learning, or did you do more learning by doing? What did that look like for you? Think about that for a moment, because that might inform how you think about going into being a teacher and what your students may need or expect. Finally, Harmer has us look at this idea of student motivation and the different kinds of student motivation. He defines extrinsic motivation as what's coming from outside of the classroom. So issues of motivation related to the attitude of society, family, and peers to the subject that is being studied. Whereas intrinsic motivation is generated by what happens inside the classroom. So this is probably the area where teachers have the most influence over how motivated our students might be by how we, what we generate in the classroom in terms of interest and excitement. Of course, sustaining motivation can be a real challenge. Our students may face boredom, they may face discouragement when it comes to learning English, and they may start to lack that motivation when things feel really challenging. And also this concept of student agency, or the idea that students have some responsibility for their learning and how that's related to student motivation. Assuring that students have agency or some amount of decision-making is a crucial component in sustaining their motivation. But this isn't just about giving students more decision-making power, right? It's about encouraging them to take responsibility for their learning. Responsibility for their learning. But what does that look like? So I want you to give some thought to that comment. to that question. That's going to be some version of that is going to be your discussion board question for Unit 1. So give some thought to this concept of motivation and also how that relates to learning styles and multiple intelligences, and have a look at that discussion board question. So what you should do next is have a look at the task lists for all the details and activities for day 1. Make sure you read it thoroughly, understand everything you need to do, and enjoy the rest of the lessons and activities. I look forward to seeing you soon.